Hi, everyone. My name is James Goodwin, and like Maggie said, I'm a senior policy analyst here at CPR, and where I have been, where I've had the distinct privilege of working on regulatory policy issues for about 14 years now. I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Tom McGarity to talk about his newest book, Demolition Agenda: How Trump Tried to Dismantle American Government and What Biden Needs to Do to Save It. Tom is the Joe R. and Teresa Lozano Long Endowed Chair in Administrative Law at the University of Texas in Austin. He is a member of the board of directors of the Center for Progressive Reform and a past president of the organization. Tom is also one of the original founders of the organization, which I point out because we are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. What can I tell you about Tom? Well, Tom has been teaching law for longer than I have been alive, seriously. And in that time, he has written on a wide variety of areas, including administrative law, environmental law, occupational safety and health law, food safety law, scientific integrity, and torts. But there's a common through line to all of that, as this book illustrates, and that is a major focus of his scholarship has been on the regulatory system, in particular on why the regulatory system is so important, what's keeping it from achieving its full potential, and what we can do to make it work even better. Among his notable scholarship in this area has been his work on cost-benefit analysis and ossification of the rulemaking process. I think when I look at Tom's work, I was looking at his CV, and I think what really sets it apart is his ability to make this area of policy and law, regulatory policy, so compelling for everyone, including a lay audience. And that's not nothing, because it's often dismissed as a very wonky and dry subject. And I think one of the ways he's done that is through his inimitable way of telling really compelling stories. He takes these really abstract fights over regulatory policy, and he shows why they are so important and how they can have a real impact on the lives of real people. He also has a knack for capturing these fights with evocative terms and phrases. So things like sophisticated sabotage and regulation is blood sport. And so I think to that list, we can now add Demolition Agenda, right? So Tom, thank you so much for joining us to discuss your new book.
Well, thank you for having me.
So just to get us started, I wanted to take us back to that night in November of 2016. So I remember this because my oldest daughter had just been born. I was away on, I had just started paternity leave. And, we get this awful news that Trump had won the election. So the next day, CPR, I remember this very vividly, there was this all hands on deck meeting at CPR where we're trying to figure out what were we going to do about this? How are we going to fight to save the regulatory system under these difficult circumstances? And you were involved in that call. You played a very important role in that call and helped CPR plan its response. Can you take us back to that night in November, what your initial thoughts were when the shock wore off about what this meant for the regulatory system and how we could fight back?
Well, I had several thoughts. One was, well, we've been here before. So I had written a book that was published in 2013 by an academic press called Freedom to Harm. And it was really a history going all the way back to the latter part of the 19th century of this regulatory reform movement, as it was called at the time. And there really, the regulatory reform, or these assaults, I call them, on the regulatory structure that we had in place, came in four big waves. The first was the Reagan administration. That was a shock to everyone too. I can tell you, at the end of the Carter administration, to see Ronald Reagan in place and put into place his people who were dead set on doing something about regulatory reform. That was one of the three cornerstones of his agenda. Then things calmed down a bit. After about 1983, we had a few, what shall we say, crises. Maybe a better word is, Gorsuch comes to mind, but it's not Justice Gorsuch. It is Ann Gorsuch, where we had a real crisis at EPA. And throughout the remainder of the Reagan administration, things kind of calmed down. Then with Clinton in office, we had elections in 1994, and we had the Gingrich Congress. And now everything was in the assaults were in Congress. And I lived through that, testified 6 or 7 times on that, used all my advantage miles to go testify. And that nearly was successful, but still left the major structure, what I call in Demolition Agenda, the protective edifice in place. And then we had another major assault at the outset of the George W. Bush administration, particularly after a couple of years when the Senate and the House were both in the hands of the Republican Party. Survived that. Obama comes in place and starts to get very active during his second term. And at that point, we had another big assault, but it kind of faded too. So my thinking was, as I was talking to CPR folks about what should we do by way of resistance, one thing that was in the back of my mind the whole time is somebody needs to document this. Somebody needs to hold these people accountable so that when it's over, we can hold the people that were responsible for these assaults accountable. So I started collecting files. I ultimately collected about 5 file cabinets full of files on this from every agency that I could think of that was out there protecting people that were part of this protective edifice that they were assaulting. The difference this time, and I think it was a big one, was that in the past, it had been what I called in the Demolition Agenda, the free marketeers or the free market fundamentalists. They've been around since Hayek back in the 1940s, and they've always been against government in pretty much any form. They were still here and still very much alive and well and fed very handsomely by funders. We had the business Republicans, I call them now, in Freedom to Harm, I call them the business community, but it really is more on the Republican side. So I call them the business Republicans this time. And they had worked together through the Chamber of Commerce and Club for Growth and that sort of thing to try to limit the protections that government agencies perform. This time, starting with the Tea Party and moving as Trump co-opted the Tea Party in 2015 and 2016, we have something I call Trumpian populists. And this is really 3 groups of people that came together. The religious right, which had been around a long time, but hadn't focused a whole lot on regulation. We had the white working class, which had been opposed to regulation, some of which when it appeared to threaten their jobs, and were very sensitive to appeals to saving jobs or creating jobs. And then, as I say, the white working class, and then we had more, what shall I say, profound populists that were extremely active, sometimes even as far as the alt-right, but collected in groups like Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works. So a grassroots kind of group there as well. That made it different because that provided this base that Trump was always applying to. And these 3 groups, now I'm talking about business Republicans, the free marketeers, and these Trumpian populists, they had a lot of clashes. They don't agree about everything. But one thing that brought them all together was this assault on regulation. So this time it was much more profound. This time it was much nastier than it had been in the past. It was pretty nasty during the Gingrich Congress, but now it was much nastier, and it came from all directions, including, of course, the conservative media. So my idea was to document that, and that's what I've tried to do in this book.
Yeah, and it shows. I mean, your 5 file cabinets definitely show up in the endnote section of the book, which is several pages. So I think that's right. I think one of the great things about your book, or one of the really useful things about the book, is you bring the receipts, right? We get this comprehensive catalog of all the damage that the Trump administration attempted to do during its 4 years in office. And when I was reading back on this, I was kind of surprised by some of the stories I had forgotten. I mean, there was just so much that, and I think sort of in hindsight, I'd like tried to expunge them from my mind for my own sanity. And one of the stories I had somehow forgotten about was the EPA what are they called? The air truck gliders rule, where the rollback on those protections, which for my mind, in my mind, sort of epitomized in a lot of ways what was so despicable about the Trump administration's assault on safeguards. For those of us on this call who are not familiar with that story, can you tell us about that story and what made it so egregious?
Sure. Well, that's one of many, and I want to say at the outset, the book doesn't have nearly all of the assaults in it. I had to take a lot of things out of the book, and I had to really prioritize. But there's a lot more there in terms of, say, Obama regulations that the Trump administration went after and tried to get rid of. But the glider truck regulation is an interesting one, because it was this niche industry that was really created around the regulatory process to evade it. So we have trucks, those big trucks that are on the highways that you see all the time, and they're subject to new source performance standards for new truck engines. And the companies sometimes fight those standards, and they're given lots of time, so they're built into the model years. And usually the standards come out and they're applicable 2 or 3 model years hence. But we had this new little industry that got formed called the glider truck industry. They put together these glider kits, which are just, it's the chassis and basically the exterior bones of the truck. And then they import into it a refurbished engine and engine train. And what this does is it allows them to charge about 25% less for the finished product. But that finished product is that old engine, which isn't subject to the new source performance standards and pollutes a whole lot more than the new trucks. And the more of these you have out on the highway, the less reduction in pollutant you're going to get from that new source performance standard. So in the Biden administration, the EPA promulgated a new source performance standard, a new one for glider trucks. This time, though, they said, not for glider trucks, but for new trucks. This time, though, they said glider trucks are going to be considered new trucks. Okay. The glider truck folks went berserk, not surprisingly. And at the end of the day, EPA gave an exception for 300 glider trucks per year. And that, of course, didn't make the industry happy, didn't satisfy them at all. And they sued. But what's very interesting about this was that the manufacturers of the new engines said, wait a minute, we can comply with this new source performance standard, and we plan to comply with it. And we don't want these guys out there competing with us, selling these old engines that are big polluters. And they also, by the way, didn't have nearly the miles per gallon efficiency of the newer engines. So there was an instance, and not an isolated one, of the industry itself saying Trump administration you've gone too far. When the Trump administration, of course, said, we're going to abolish all of this, which they did. We're just going to get rid of, we're going to go back and change EPA's conclusion that glider trucks are subject to the new source performance standard, and let as many glider trucks as they can produce be produced.
Great. So, so that exemplifies how EPA was one of the big targets during the Trump administration for regulatory attacks. I think another one, fair to say from your book, another one of the big targets was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. You know, in the grand scheme of things, the CFPB is one of the newer agencies. It was designed, I think, with a lot of lessons learned, right, from the older agencies on how to shield them from politicized attacks and these sorts of things. Yet, you know, the Trump administration still made a lot of progress weakening this agency in its 4 years. For people who may not be familiar with the CFPB, can you describe the important work that they do in, you know, some of the absurd lengths that the Trump administration went to weaken this important agency?
Oh, sure. Well, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, it was the brainchild of my former colleague, Elizabeth Warren. And it basically is an agency headed by a single director that is looking out for consumers. It administers maybe 15 or 20 statutes that have been around, many of them for a long time, but one important one is the one that created CFPB, and that's the Dodd-Frank Act, which empowered CFPB to go beyond what some of the other statutes had empowered. And back in the old days, it was the Federal Trade Commission or the Commissioner of the Currency or the Fed. It empowered CFPB to also go after abusive practices by entities that were trying to fleece consumers, particularly in the context of lending and things like that. It got started, got off to a great start. The first director was named Cordery during the Obama administration. The statute gave Cordery a 5-year term, so he could be serving well into the Trump administration, and he did. Promulgated lots of regulations, launched many enforcement areas. You've got $12 billion worth of money that people have been cheated out of returned to them. But here comes Donald Trump. And Cordery decided, for whatever reason, he was going to run for governor of Ohio. So he resigned about 9 months into the Trump administration. Trump replaced him on an interim basis with Mick Mulvaney. Now, Mulvaney was at the same time serving as the director of the Office of Management and Budget. So this was a second job for him, but he took it very seriously, and he went after the structure of the agency in a big way, reassigning offices, bringing offices that were being too aggressive under his direct control, so that they wouldn't be, assigning political appointees to any civil servant or senior executive service officer that had any kind of power, assigned one of his political people to watch over him. He left after almost a year and was replaced by Kathy Kraninger, who continued pretty much the way he had done. And among other things, they undid a lot of the rules. I opened the book with a real tragedy, in my opinion. And that was pretty much the last regulation under Cordery, which dealt with these arbitration clauses that are stuck in the fine print of whatever document you're writing or that you click on the computer. That basically, when you click on that or sign that document, you're waiving your right to a jury trial. And you're saying this will be arbitrated by an arbitrator that's usually selected by the person selling you the product. The CFPB undertook an extensive examination of this issue and came out with regulations limiting the use of arbitration clauses in consumer contracts. We're in the Trump administration now when this comes out. Both houses of Congress are controlled by the Republican Party, and we have, of course, Donald Trump in the White House. And the Congress passes a joint resolution under the obscure Congressional Review Act, which throws out this rule once Donald Trump signs the joint resolution. And worse, not only does it throw out the rule, but CFPB can never implement a similar rule without express authorization from Congress to do so. So this is almost permanently dead, which is, as I say, a real tragedy, because these arbitrations don't work, as I point out in the very first illustration of the book. Other things CFPB went after during the Obama administration were like payday lenders that are lined up at all your military bases and lots of on the poor sections of town to give loans of $500 to $1,000 at enormous interest rates, ranging from 300% to 1,700%. And people get trapped in these loans and can never get out of them. They also wrote regulations on debt collectors and also servicers of student loans. So they did a lot of good work, which during the Trump administration, one, they didn't do any more good work. They stopped promulgating regulations of any significance. And two, they rolled back a number of the Obama administration's regulations.
Great. We have a great question that just came in. I think I'm going to switch to before I go on to my next question. And this person asks, in the course of doing your research, did you come across any demolition activities that struck you as particularly surprising or the most surprising? I mean, was there anything that was just so incredibly shocking to you that even the Trump administration would have the audacity to take this on? Or on the flip side, was there anything that you were surprised by, like that rollback was probably kind of a good idea? Anything like that?
Well, I lost my capacity to be shocked to some extent in this thing. But one, we can talk about the CFPB. One real shocker was the industry from the get-go and its enemies in Congress hated the fact that Cordry served for a 5-year term and that the head of it would serve for a 5-year term. And they moved heaven and earth to get that taken out of the statute. So far as back in the Obama administration, almost shutting down Congress just to get that done. Well, they also challenged it in court. And this wound up going to the Supreme Court in the Sela Law case. And one thing that was really shocking was to see CFPB abandon CFPB. What can I say? The Trump administration said, well, they're right. We are unconstitutional. That forced the Supreme Court to literally appoint a special attorney to represent CFPB because CFPB's constitutionality, because CFPB wasn't willing to say that it was constitutional. Ultimately, of course, the Supreme Court held that aspect of CFPB was unconstitutional, but the rest of it could stand. There's still, of course, lots of efforts to undermine CFPB, limiting its budget and that sort of thing. So that was a shocker. There was one mildly good thing, or maybe there's more. One that comes immediately to mind was I was surprised to see the Trump administration write standards for airplanes, pollution standards. Why would the Trump administration do that? Well, it turns out once you dug a little deeper, you found out why. And that is because the airline manufacturers needed it. They needed it because an international standard setting organization said that you're not going to be able to fly these planes in international airspace if they don't meet these standards. So the airline industry went to the Trump administration and said, look, we need some standards. And they said, well, what'll work for you? And they promulgated standards that were very easy to meet, and they did work for them. But that was a surprise at the outset to see them write those standards.
Great. So, yeah, so I guess the other problem with reading your book is it's kind of trauma-inducing in a lot of ways. You read all these horrific stories and you're reminded of all this awful stuff that we lived through for 4 years. But, you know, there is a glimmer of hope. There's a silver lining that keeps peeking through in the pages of your book that I wanted to discuss or have you discuss a little. And that is the role of progressive advocates, many of whom are joining us on the call today. And in a lot of ways, they are the heroes of your book, right? They're the ones who were in the trenches fighting back against these things. And despite the difficult circumstances, they had a pretty good record to show for it. So can you talk about, you know, what the progressive advocacy community was able to achieve during the Trump administration and how they were able to achieve that?
Sure. Well, they achieved a remarkable resistance. Part of it's attributable to the Trump administration's ineptitude. The people that were put in place at the outset were, well, I'm not the only one, but call it a kakistocracy, right? A government of the least competent. And they certainly made it easy to challenge, in court at least, what they were doing. And fortunately, there were groups out there, many of them, who were willing to challenge them in court and also to challenge them in the political arena as well. So like Natural Resources Defense Council, during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, they filed a new lawsuit on average of once every 10 days. And we had Earth Justice out there, defenders of wildlife. We had the Biological Diversity, Center for Biological Diversity group out there, and they were really going after what the Department of Interior was doing. We haven't talked much about that right now, but they were giving up the store when it came to our public lands. They were out there fighting it, and almost everyone. Fortunately, there were people that were willing to fund that, like Bloomberg, who put a lot of money into trying to keep climate disruption regulations in place. So they were out there, they were fighting, and they were remarkably successful. By one measure, the Trump administration only succeeded about 17% of the time. And part of that was they just ignored the rules. They changed the effective dates at the outset of any rule that was about to go into effect from the Obama administration. Well, that's a rule. Like, you have to go through a process to do that. They didn't follow notice and comment carefully as they did things. They interpreted the statutes as narrowly as you possibly could to say that, well, what the Trump administration, what the Biden administration had done was too broad a construction. We saw that particularly with the Clean Power Plan that the Biden administration offered up as they replaced it with the Affordable Clean Energy Plan. Clean Power Plan said, power plants, you need to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, and you can do that by being more efficient, but there's only a limited amount you can do on a plant without carbon capture and control, which doesn't exist well enough at this point. So think about shifting the load from the big dirties, as they call them, these coal-fired power plants, shift it to gas-fired power plants, which aren't as emitting of greenhouse gases, and more importantly, shift it to renewables. And so that was included within the guidelines they provided to the states for controlling greenhouse gas emissions. Trump administration said, no, you can't do any of that. All you can do is enhance the efficiency, the heat efficiency of the individual power plant. You can't go beyond the fence line to get ultimately the greenhouse gases reduced. That issue, by the way, is before the Supreme Court right now as we speak. It still hasn't gone away, and those groups are still fighting. And I guess we will be till the Supreme Court renders its opinion in a month or so. So there were lots of fights. As I say, the ones that really impressed me were up in Alaska, fighting the Pebble Mine, the Anwar, opening up the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve up there. Lots of efforts to open those up. They were fought each time, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but the fights were out there.
Great. So starting to have some more questions pop in from the audience. And one that I'm seeing a couple of times, and one that I wanted to ask you about was, at the end of your book, you talk about, well, what can the Biden administration do to rebuild the regulatory system from the damage that the Trump administration did, but also to make it stronger and stand up to, likely future attacks that we can expect. I think it's fair to say we can expect a Republican control of either or both Congresses after the midterms, these sorts of things. And I know in your book, you had a chance to talk a little bit about the early Biden administration effort of rebuilding the regulatory system. And then since you've sent off your manuscript to the publisher, you probably have a few more data points to draw on. What's your early assessment of how the Biden administration is doing on rebuilding the regulatory system? Can you assign them a grade, Professor McGarity?
Well, from what I've seen so far, I guess they're a B+ to an A-, somewhere in that range. They've done a lot. They've tried hard. They started off in very bad shape, because one thing we haven't talked about is, and this was almost invisible, I think, to the ordinary folks out there, not covered in the news much, was the Trump administration really went after the civil service. And these people, if there's heroes in the book, these people are the heroes too, because they stayed there and they did what they needed to do. Sometimes they engaged in civil service disobedience, as one law professor called it. But most of the time they just did their jobs, but they refused to let the political folks say that something was based on science when it wasn't. And they refused to let them interpret the laws if the statutes wouldn't support that. So they were there, fighting what must have been incredibly frustrating battles within these agencies. Now, a lot of them just didn't. A bunch of them were of my vintage. I worked at the EPA for 2 years back in 1977 through 1979, 3 years really. And a lot of the people that I went in when the agency was new were retiring. And this gave them absolutely a good excuse to retire. A lot of them were just run out of the agency because they were assigned to make work positions that they were way overqualified for. But the political people in the agency just wanted them out of there. So the agency started off at the beginning of the Biden administration with a real depletion of not just people, but of institutional memory as well. And that happened across the board. So they were starting off from a bad position. Now, the things that Biden could do by executive order, he did. And I'd give him an A for that, maybe even A+. Rejoined the Paris Accords, threw out some ridiculous Trump administration executive orders, like one that required agencies to repeal 2 regulations for every 1 regulation they promulgated, and to produce a regulatory budget so that they never actually increased compliance costs. Throughout that one, another one that required agencies to set up task force to look at agency regulations that could be repealed. And that really got done on day one. Now, a lot of those executive orders told the agencies to do things, many of which got done, but many of which are still haven't happened. In the area of climate changes, to use one example, we now have in place the Obama regulations on automobile greenhouse gas emissions. The Trump had relaxed them. We put them back into place, but we lost a year in the process. Methane emissions from oil and gas production, that's one thing that the Democratic controlled Congress at the outset of the Obama administration threw out under the congressional review action. The Trump administration's revisions to the Biden administration's regulations on methane emissions from oil and gas production. Some of the Department of Energy efficiency standards that were loosened, some for the most bizarre reasons. Like Trump just didn't like shower heads. They just didn't pour enough water. And he said that just made people stay in the shower longer. Well, the industry was perfectly happy with the shower heads, as were most people. But DOE said, okay, we're going to modify the shower heads. And Trump thought that light bulbs, the LED light bulbs made him look orange. So they repealed the Obama administration's phase out of incandescent bulbs. Well, those are back in place now. So we've made some progress. On the Clean Power Plan, as I mentioned, we're not done yet. The Biden administration says it's going to write new regulations. They're not going to be just replacing the Trump ones with the Biden ones. And it's beginning to look more like maybe the strategy is we're going to promulgate some regulations for hazardous mercury and hazardous materials for effluents from power plants. And they'll be stringent enough that these old plants are finally going to retire, and we won't have to worry about their greenhouse gas emissions. So a roundabout way of getting at the greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not sure that's going to work. I'd rather see them get in there and do something with the power plants, but I don't blame them for waiting until the Supreme Court says what it's going to say about its power to reach beyond the fence line. Coal leasing is the Biden administration tried to put back into place a coal leasing moratorium and put into place an oil and gas leasing moratorium on public lands. But a Louisiana district judge threw it out. So we're seeing the Obama administration making some new coal leases in the Powder River Basin. And we're seeing a bunch of new oil and gas leasing on public lands, more leases issued during the first year of the Biden administration than during the first year of the Trump administration, although that seems to be tailing off fairly significantly in the second year. And they've gone after some new things like hydrofluorocarbon emissions, which are another greenhouse gas emissions. So I give them, they're doing well, but they started off in a very bad place, and it's taken them some time. If the 2022 elections wind up giving one or both houses of Congress to the Republicans, this will probably all shut down, or at least slow down considerably, like it did in 2011 after the 2010 elections gave what Obama called a shellacking to the Democratic Party.
If that happens, I suspect you'll be flying into Washington to testify against more anti-regulatory bills. One thing you had raised is the Supreme Court case over the EPA's climate rules, and I know this is something I wanted to ask. A lot of people in the questions section that have wanted to raise this too. You know, in a lot of ways, the Trump administration, as far as the regulatory system goes, hasn't really ended. And one of its biggest effects was remaking the federal judiciary into this truly terrifying anti-regulatory force that now looms over us for the next several decades. You touch upon this in your book. And again, we've had more data points since you sent off your manuscript to the publisher. Did you expect the federal judiciary to be this bad? I mean, we have this opinion from last night where the Fifth Circuit pretty blatantly strikes down a significant chunk of the entire administrative state, just recklessly. Were you expecting it to be this bad? What can we do as regulatory advocates to minimize the damage from this federal judiciary?
Well, about the only thing you can do is appoint more judges, unless we want to do something rather extreme, like expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court, which is always a possibility, and I think is coming back into vogue a bit after the leaked opinion in the abortion case. The short answer is, yeah, I expected it to be pretty bad. I expected that especially when during the campaign, Trump said, here, I'm going to the Federalist Society. Well, I've been following the Federalist Society for decades. And when he said, I'm going to the Federalist Society for my list of judges, and he came up with, justices rather, and he came up with that list, I said, that's, you're going to have some strong anti-government people on the Supreme Court if you do that list. We don't need to revisit the Gorsuch, the fact that Obama didn't get to appoint justice to replace Justice Scalia. That's all well known. Kavanaugh, I wrote pieces saying that he's going to do bad things for regulation. There are other areas as well, but you could just look at his record and see that. It's not so clear with Amy Coney Barrett, but it's becoming clearer all the time. Yes, the judiciary was an impediment to Trump as he tried to move past what he could do under the Administrative Procedures Act. What's happening now is, since you can go find a judge anywhere, in many instances, particularly in the context of the Department of Interior, also CFPB, to challenge a regulation, it's not channeled up like many EPA regulations to the DC Circuit. We're seeing some serious forum shopping, and we're getting some strange rulings. You mentioned the one yesterday out of the Fifth Circuit. Well, the Fifth Circuit's always been conservative. I wrote an article. It was really part of the a project I did for the administrative conference on forum shopping for judicial review of agency action, way back in the early 1980s. And it became the basis for some changes so that you can't forum shop so much when the challenges are to a court of appeals. You go to a lottery and it chooses the court. Well, before that, the industries all went to the Fifth Circuit. That's where they wanted to be. And they got there by rushing as fast as they could and being the first to file. That doesn't happen anymore. But this Fifth Circuit opinion is scary for a couple of reasons. One is that it says that the administrative law judge system that's in place at the Securities and Exchange Commission is unlawful. It's unconstitutional because it deprives people of a jury trial. Well, that's going all the way back to early Supreme Court cases saying that's not true, but maybe it is now with the new Supreme Court. And it also finds that that delegation to the Securities and Exchange Commission to decide whether to go to the administrative trial and an enforcement action or file an immediate action in a federal district court. Says giving it that discretion is unconstrained and therefore violates the non-delegation doctrine. Well, the non-delegation doctrine hasn't been invoked successfully really since the New Deal. And Judge Gorsuch would like to do that more. And maybe this is an invitation to do that. But in the meantime, the Supreme Court has developed a doctrine that I think is particularly problematic, called the major questions doctrine, which says that if an agency regulation deals with an issue that's of vast economic or political significance, then we don't assume that Congress meant to delegate that power to the agency, but rather will interpret Congress's delegation very narrowly because it's so important. Well, everything agencies do are important. So you can see this one swallowing the rule that's been around for about 40 years, that courts are to allow the agencies to interpret their statutes and review that to see whether they're unreasonable. Now with this major questions doctrine, we're seeing a district court in Louisiana holding that EPA's estimate of the social cost of carbon, which is just a tool you use in environmental impact statements. You use it, I guess it's not just EPA, it's all the agencies. It's an interagency group that does it. It's used in environmental impact statements. It's used in EPA regulatory impact assessments for determining whether the benefits outweigh the risk of a particular regulation. Well, this court said that's a major question. That's has vast economic and political significance. And even though nobody's ever applied it in any particular case that's been appealed, he says he issues a nationwide injunction against doing it. Now, fortunately, the Fifth Circuit stayed that injunction, but this could wind up in the Supreme Court as a major question. Well, it's a very minor, it's not a major question. It's a little tool that's used for regulatory impact assessments that may or may not have any impact at all on any particular decision. So yes, I think there's going to be a serious problem. But in terms of solving the problem, I think you have to go to Congress. So again, if Congress is in the hands of the Republicans, those problems aren't going to get solved. They're just going to be encouraged.
Great. Okay, so now I'm going to open up for some more audience questions that have been piling up. So I don't want to lose track of these. First one I'm going to raise, interesting question here. So we have in this country this history of almost these cycles where you have corrupt administrations followed by, administrations that run on sort of an anti-corruption ticket or whatever, and those quickly fizzle, and the public quickly, there are memory or like collective memory on these things, just like goldfish short, and then we put these corrupt people back into power again. How do we break that cycle? Are we seeing like the early evidence that we're going to be slipping back into this corruption cycle again under the Biden administration?
I think it could happen again. I don't know if it'll happen in the Biden administration, but if we have if we elect a Trumpian populist in 2024, we will definitely move back in that direction. And a lot of this, I think, and it's something I'm looking at now in connection with some thoughts about a future book, is who are these Trumpian populists? What is it that motivates them? And how is it that they're so easily swayed by appeals to fear, appeals to notions that they're being replaced, and appeals to just patriotism. Now, my thinking here is that we have a lot of people that espouse patriotism, that are great patriots, but if one thing we've learned over this pandemic is that we have a citizenship deficit, if you will, that we no longer find ourselves as part of a community. And I think there's something there that's, we're highly polarized now. There are more people, I think, if you look at the polls, more people are in favor of regulation than are opposed to it. One remarkable point that I picked up as I was doing the research for the book was in the same election that the state of Idaho gave Trump a 30% margin over Clinton back in 2016, put into place a referendum that put into place limitations on payday lenders, that loans could be no more than 36%. Well, that killed the payday lending industry in Idaho. And that passed by a 56% margin. So I think there are people out there that understand that there are protections out there, and then the government's necessary to provide these protections. But they're listening a lot to Fox News and their commentators who are constantly pushing them in another direction. What we've never, I haven't been able to establish is a progressive populism since back in the early 20th century. Jim Hightower, who's a friend of mine, is a populist, and he's tried to do it for years in Texas, but hasn't had a great deal of success.
Great. Let's get wonky here. I have a wonky question for you. So imagine that you are like a superhero. You put on your Super Tom cape, and you can do whatever you want to fix the forum shopping nationwide injunctions problem. How do you solve that problem, Tom? Super Tom.
It's a tricky one, because the nationwide injunctions were what stopped Trump from wiping out immigration as he would have liked to. And certainly there were a lot of conservatives complaining about nationwide injunctions back then. I do think that in particular for administrative regulation, if I had my druthers, I would channel it at least to the courts of appeals and not let a district court have jurisdiction over a challenge to a rule. Just amend the Administrative Procedures Act, the judicial review section of that, to say you may file it in a court of appeals of appropriate jurisdiction, define it that way. I don't know that I necessarily run them all through the DC circuit like the EPA statutes do. That makes the DC circuit such an important circuit that you get a lot of fights at confirmation time about who's going to be on the DC circuit. But at least make it go to a court of appeals, not let some district judge that literally don't know what they're talking about issue a nationwide injunction.
Yeah, and I think the decision on the social cost of carbon is a pretty good example of a judge not knowing what they're talking about. If you folks haven't read that decision and you need a good laugh, I commend it to you. Another question from the audience. So I'm not familiar with this, but hopefully you are. One of our audience members is asking about the rights of nature movement. Is that something you're familiar with, and do you have any thoughts on it?
Oh yeah, well that goes back a long way, of course. I think that's if you had the right judiciary, you could make that happen. I can remember back when I was a law student, a wonderful article, Should Trees Have Standing? Right? And it made a very simple and I thought powerful point. A tree is a lot more tangible than a corporation. Corporation's just a piece of paper, and corporations have standing, and various other associations have standing. Why shouldn't trees have standing, or animals have standing to protect their rights? Obviously, to the good offices of their attorneys, and I think the rights of nature movement, again, you see it in some constitutions in some countries. I don't think we'll ever see it in our constitution unless suddenly we become a lot less polarized and are able to come to agreement on something like that. Sometimes a crisis will do that, but we've had a lot of crises that didn't. I would have thought the pandemic was the kind of crisis that would bring everybody together and say, look, we need to act collectively to deal with this. There's just no two ways about it. We need to be citizens, good citizens. But it didn't. The Republicans used it very quickly to politicize things, like wearing masks and vaccines and that sort of thing.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question. So you talked a lot about you know, how civil society was able to push back against the Trump agenda, how professionals within the agencies had succeeded in defeating some of these efforts. Were there any like Trump appointees who rode to the rescue? Anybody who emerged from the Trump administration with some shred of dignity that you came across during your research?
You know, back in the Reagan administration, that did happen. There was a guy at EPA who was he was a National Review writer, strong conservative, but he left EPA and said, this is crazy what they're doing here. This is just destruction for destruction's sake. And that, of course, is what was happening in the Trump administration as well. I didn't see anybody like that. That was a Trump appointee that went out and complained. You saw it. You're starting to see it in some other areas, like Esper's book, for example, and some of the people in the White House. But you know, Pruitt, when he left the EPA, was replaced by Wheeler, and Wheeler was. Thing about Wheeler was that he was very smart and knew what to do. He knew what strings to pull to get things accomplished. He was much more successful, in my view, than Pruitt had been. Likewise, at Department of Interior when Bernhardt replaced Zinke. But we didn't see a Bernhardt or a Wheeler or somebody say, "No, this is just wrong. I'm going to leave."
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for talking to us about your book. It's a tremendous read. I highly encourage everybody to pick it up and live through the highs and the lows of those 4 years. And you know, thank you for writing it. And there was a few questions we weren't able to get to. If folks, we're going to collect them and share them with Tom, and we can report back with answers on those. But I want to thank everybody who was able to join us today for this discussion. It was a real thrill for me, and I'm glad you were all able to join us today.
Thank you so much. I had a great time too.
All right, thanks, Tom.